Hello, 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 hello. My name is Irene Lyakovetsky. Hello, welcome everyone. I'm hosting today an apps event. If you noticed, we are on Thursdays at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific. And if people can catch up in Europe and around the world, we so much appreciate your time and the opportunity to spread some knowledge today and every day. Hello, everyone. So, just talking to our audience first, while some people still joining. So if you're listening today, please share the links because we are distributing knowledge about growing FinOps discipline. And the more and more business and technology leaders realize the need for cloud financial management, the better every business is because it's easy to overspend. It's easy to stretch thin your experimentation to some consequences that business and technology leaders will have to deal with. So why don't we get proactive, educate ourselves a little bit? And today I'm extremely privileged to host on behalf of NAPS Scott Kellish. Scott is a partner solution architect with Amazon Web Services. Scott, how are you?
Wonderful, Irene. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to host an expert of your caliber, Scott, today because we're gonna discuss FinOps at enterprises, and we declared kind of very broad topic, but we want to be kind of prescriptive. Minutes here for the audience. I looked at our attendees last night, and I was pleasantly surprised that people of different business and technology level joining our session today, and it's all the way from engineers, from DevOps engineers, from QA engineers, all the way to business leaders. I've seen some of the CEOs registered. I've seen CIOs, CTOs, and this is wonderful because FinOps is a cross-functional discipline. We need people on both sides: financial, development, business, and technology working together. So, Scott, speaking of enterprise, I know you're leading the practice at Amazon Web Services and working with your clients. Can you please enlighten us a little bit? What does it mean to manage cost in the cloud? Let's start broad, and we will quickly dive into total cost of ownership and how AWS help.
Yeah, sure. Again, I want to thank you for inviting me here. I mean, managing costs in the cloud obviously is very important. In the early days of cloud, and I've been working with AWS, going back to 2011, 2012 timeframe. We've all heard the horror stories of people going in and starting to spin up instances and the like, and then suddenly getting that sticker shock a month later. FinOps, now is a tried and true practice. That we are really working with customers to understand and adopt in order to be able to help them with this challenge. I get this question a lot. Primary reason people are using the cloud. And cost is obviously very compelling. The ability to shift from a capex to an opex pricing model, and it's typically a conversation starter. When we're talking to customers, but it's really agility and speed are the number one issues that customers come and are using the cloud. And those two things, really lead to value above and beyond the total cost of ownership reduction. We customers are able to benefit from staff productivity, improvements on sustainability, operational resilience, business agility. So, there's a number of different ways to view this, and AWS is, we've done a lot of work to try to understand, what are the value drivers for customers. We like to frame it, in the form of a kind of a cloud value framework, if you will, looking, tactical things, all the way to strategic benefits of using the cloud. The AWS Cloud Economics team did a study in 2019. I'll just give you some of the things that we found that came out of that. Cost savings. Obviously, that's the number one topic starter. But we found that customers were seeing on average 27% reduction in IT infrastructure costs as a percentage of revenue. So again, that shift from capex to opex, reducing that variable spend, and primarily by being able to leverage AWS's economy of scale, right? So the fact that we have so much infrastructure and the buying power that comes with that versus what a company could do on itself. by itself. Staff productivity is another point, 57% increase in the number of virtual machines managed per server admin versus that same individual on-prem. And a lot of that is, previous tactical work is no longer needed because of the introduction and use of automation in running all of those the resources in the cloud. I mentioned sustainability. Customers using the cloud, on average, are seeing an 88% reduction in their carbon footprint. Again, because the AWS develops all of its own hardware, the scale that we're operating at, but we're able to offer those compute resources at a much lower carbon consumption rate than what a company could do, typically on its own. Another data point: operational resilience. Right, 56% reduction in unplanned downtime, and that's achieved through enhanced availability, security. And the last one, business agility, 37% reduction in time to market for new apps. Right, so the whole ability to be able to spin up something, in the cloud, fail fast, be able to, turn around and try out features and get them out to your customers. In some cases, near real time. It's just been, really fascinating to watch and see how customers are benefiting from this. Again, customers, in the early days were asking, is cloud right for me? That's not really the right question. It's really about, what do you expect to realize, when you start leveraging the cloud? It's not just, it's not a black and white question.
Exactly. And cost saving is already an old story. All right. So I hear more and more from the experts. It's about experimentation. It's about business agility. You mentioned, Scott. So absolutely. Speaking to our audience, please, if you're watching us, listening to us, let us know. Let us know where you're joining from. What's your title? What's your current FinOps challenges or maybe successes? We want your comments. We want your engagement because, frankly, this is a conversation for you. So Scott is here to answer your questions. So please write to us in the comments and we'll make sure that, those questions will be addressed. So Scott, speaking of adapting cloud enterprises, what are the major pain points? You mentioned some of them, but at the same time, there are pitfalls there because people trying too fast, right? We know how that goes, how cloud saves it all. Okay, Can we get to FinOps a little bit through that lens?
This continues to be, a challenge, and we're working very hard to be able to get information out and help customers understand what their cloud journey should really look like. Too often we hear from customers, that they're focused on getting that first application running, and they don't necessarily do the things that should be done to set them up for success after that first application. So, we see and we've talked to lots of, businesses, multiple industries and geographies, and we continue to see a direct correlation between lack of mechanisms for cost management and overall, preparation of how they are going to adopt and use the cloud. And things like, customers being behind schedule on migrations or migrations, stalling entirely. And this in turn ends up having an impact on their ROI because they end up having to maintain their on-prem and their cloud environments in parallel for longer. At the end of the day, the solution really is to one, adopt the cloud operating model, and I can talk about that, and then cloud financial management principles. Both in setting up the initial pre-migration planning, during the migration, and then after the migration once the workload is up and running in the cloud.
Yes, please. Let's talk about cloud financial management because, again, some of the principles can help, right, our listeners to get started.
Yeah. So before I speak to that, let me just quickly touch on the cloud operating model. Businesses have been running IT, operations on-prem for 30, 40 years, and they know how to do that very well. The challenge comes in, when you're taking a look at how are you going to, use the cloud. It's about how do you transform your on-prem IT operating model into a cloud operating model, because not necessarily a lot of the things that you're doing on-prem already, things around user access management, for example, right? Those are going to translate over, but they're going to have to have a little bit different look and feel than they would on-prem. So a lot of this is really about taking a look at, what do you do today? How do you map that into what it's going to look like in the cloud environment? And a big part of that is really understanding, not just focusing on a single application, but focusing on the entire cloud environment, not necessarily as an extension of your on-prem data centers, right? Because customers are coming to the cloud to leverage, all the different services and capabilities that, an AWS has to offer. For example, the agility, the ability to, to spin up things, very quickly, all that. But they have to figure out how to, make that transition and map in. And part of that is setting up, figuring out what is that environment going to look like. So you take a look at something like, log management for an application, right? So, all too often, we'll hear customers, they'll go and they've migrated the first application, they've, the application is generating logs. They consider that a success. Now they go to migrate that or move that second application, and they're starting that whole process over again. When you're setting up, their cloud operating model and what your kind of infrastructure is going to look like, something like logs needs to be handled from a centralized process. It's the same with cost management, right? You have customers, start out with a single AWS account, but as their environments grow, they'll add more accounts. We like to recommend the customers use accounts as an isolation barrier. So, having lots of accounts, you want to have a single view of your cost that, that kind of bubbles up. So there's a whole bunch of different, that tactics and planning that customers need to think about. I mean, just in setting up, your overall cloud environment in AWS, customers need to think about over 35 different services in AWS and how they're going to strategically use those to set up that. That's before they deployed, a single application. Just how are they going to set up that whole governance model? So back to CFM. So, we like to think about it, kind of from four perspectives or four buckets, if you will. We call them see, save, plan, and run. And they're not necessarily done sequentially, but there is a kind of sequential, look to these depending on where the customer is in their journey. So C really focuses on establishing cost visibility, right? Measuring, what you're spending, and providing accountability, whether that's going to be through a showback or a chargeback mechanism. So things within this bucket, are going to be like, how are you going to structure your accounts? Are you going to follow a landing zone model where you're going to separate accounts for security and for logging and for, user sandbox, type of activities? As companies grow, many times, they may acquire other companies that might be using AWS already, and they need to bring that company's AWS resources into their own, or they may be getting ready to spin off a division. So having this multi-account structure that makes it easy to kind of segregate those different lines of business while still being able to have a bottom-up view of your cost, is a critical consideration. Reporting, monitoring, really understanding, what is the real-time cost of all the cloud resources that are being used. Are they meeting budgets, that have been established, and being able to quickly identify, when there's some sort of outlier that needs to be addressed. Again, I already mentioned chargeback and showback, but how do you go about allocating costs? So when we think about it from the CFM perspective, the CFO is getting this AWS bill, right? That basically represents all the spend for the entire organization. At the end of the day, he needs to be able to understand where every single penny is coming from. At the same time, we want to see customers, adopt a bottom-up approach where they're actually having the engineers, right? Because in the old days, IT was doing the purchasing for all the compute capacity that was running in a data center. So it was very easy to understand, and budget for costs. But now with the cloud, the engineers themselves are the ones who are typically responsible for the costs that are incurred. So the use of something like, showbacks, for example, is a way of trying to instill a mindset change, if you will, so that the engineers actually think about, what is the effect of this particular server I'm picking, this EC2 instance I'm deciding to launch here, from a cost perspective, and increasingly from a sustainability perspective, we hope, not just, it's the cloud. I can just go and spin it up and set it and forget it. And then the last part is really around, in the C bucket is really around, measuring and kind of understanding what your efficiencies are, right? So there's been a lot of talk recently, past couple of years around unit cost. So, it's one thing to sit there and take a look at your AWS bill and see, a dramatic change from one month to the next and get alarmed. But the thing you need to understand is, what drove that? Did the application that's resulting in that cost increase suddenly have a gigantic spike in users? So this whole notion of unit cost is really, what is the cost to operate this particular workload for the value that's being delivered to a particular user? And so as long as the unit cost is being driven down, meaning, you're able to serve more users for the same amount of money, the fact that the cost, the actual AWS bill is going up is a good thing in my perspective.
Yeah, you mentioned few critical points, Scott. So engineers' accountability, right? Now engineers have more freedom, and that's why more responsibility, I would say, right? So what about forecasting? Because in our last session, our speaker Dieter Matzion mentioned that machine learning, with all the technology in mind, it will not know what kind of project you're starting. So
Yeah.
forecasting is still very human task. So what's the best practice there, Scott? Yeah.
Yeah, well, that kind of gets into the second of the four buckets, what we call SAVE. SAVE focuses on cost optimization capabilities. That really help customers pay for the resources that they actually need, not what they're using, but what do they actually need. So whereas C is really about understanding where the last penny is going. C is about being able to ensure that you're using the right size instances, that instances are being used when they're needed, right? So if you're running a website, for example, and your typical end users are accessing the site Monday through Friday, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense to have that compute capacity available over the weekend. So the ability to kind of to scale down the web server capacity on the weekend and then bring it back up again on Monday, is one example of how customers can save a significant amount of money in the grand scheme of things. So it's all about identifying and eliminating waste. Many times customers are deploying workloads, getting that first app running, and they don't necessarily go through and do a baseline, to understand what are the instances that I've deployed right now for this workload, are these really appropriate for the amount of user load that I'm experiencing? And that's really critical also from a monitoring perspective, because you can't really identify anomalies, whether it's an operational anomaly, a cost anomaly, unless you understand what your normal baseline is. So you're going through and understanding that your baseline usage, whether those resources that you've allocated are appropriate or not, and then picking the appropriate resource types, whether it's a particular EC2 instance size. You might be picking when an instance is running, and the Monday through Friday example that I gave. And then the third part of this is really around continually evaluating new cloud offerings, right? We're constantly innovating, constantly, coming out with new EC2 instance types. We just announced Graviton, another generation of Graviton 3. It's not a set and forget once you get the application running in the cloud. You have to continually, be going through and reevaluating, whether you can take advantage of additional innovation that AWS has brought.
Absolutely. So I'm thinking about what's the basic knowledge engineers must possess now, because you can be dangerous for yourself and your company. Okay, when you start the instances that runs overnight, and it's tens of $1,000s later that you did not even think, right, is gonna occur. So what's like the kind of basic mindset? Because we talk a lot about mindset shift from old on-prem thinking to cloud.
Yeah, well, I think a big part of it is, and part of this is made available, by the services that we offer, but it's really this notion of you want to automate everything. A lot of companies out there will practice a infrastructure as code methodology. We totally advocate that, this notion that, every resource that you're running in the cloud should be the result of a templated a mechanism that was used to create that. That ties then into this whole notion, from a DevOps perspective of, having a continuous deployment, continuous integration pipeline. But this whole notion that, if you go and deploy a resource, it should all be scripted. And if you need to make changes to those resources, it's done through that R&D type of process that we would normally do for any application. So you don't want to, as a best practice, we don't like to see customers going in and, making a change on an instance, because this gets into this whole cats versus sheep analogy that I'm sure you've heard before. So as a best practice here, engineers, should be thinking about how are they going to automate everything that they do, in order to be able to make it scalable, make it reproducible, and reduce, typical mistakes, that they might encounter as their scale starts to grow over time.
Yep, and what I hear a lot, I think a lot of problems can be proactively addressed before they occur just with better communications. Scott, do you work with clients who are really very successful in getting teams on the same board, all roles, business leaders, financial engineers, everyone in between, right? So what kind of communication works the best when, again, cloud costs can occur very fast?
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely, that's kind of the main tenets behind FinOps, right? Having this top-down, bottom-up approach, where everyone ultimately has a stake and ownership in the cost that's going to result from the consumption of IT. So, from the CFO level down, being able to understand, where that AWS bill is coming from, being able to set up, budgets, and create forecasts from that. And then from the bottom up again, having the engineers who ultimately are responsible for that consumption, be able to make informed decisions about the resources that they are consuming, and then do it in such a way that they are able to minimize errors that can occur, by leveraging things such as automation. The other aspect of it, which you touched on earlier, was increased use of machine learning to help customers be able to detect issues at a faster pace than they would normally be able to do manually. As customers' environments grow larger and larger, it becomes, I think, really unrealistic for engineers to understand every little thing that's happening in the environment. So, using machine learning, which a lot of partners, including NOps, bring to bear, to be able to understand what does the baseline operation look like, right? What does good look like? So that you can then identify when there's a deviation from that. And then the next part of that then is really, how do we then go and react to that, right? And that's really the whole kind of, I think, the driving emphasis around AI ops, right? It's not just a matter of, going out and saying, we've got a problem and identify what the root cause is. The next step is really, have we seen this before? Or has anything changed in the environment recently that may have resulted in this? And after you understand that, the next part is, and I really kind of think this is kind of the holy grail, is being able to automatically remediate it, right? So that's where the automation comes in, the use of runbooks, to ultimately try to get to this world where the systems are able to detect the problem and correct it before the end customer has any inkling that there's a problem.
Yep. And I'm still on this cultural kind of organizational point, because nothing happens until people really get together, right, on the same mission and an understanding of the roles. So do you think FinOps discipline, FinOps even center of excellence at some point, right, when they start forming, does it belong to financial side of the business, or is still technology leaders drive that? Because there got to be one party accountable. It cannot be everybody, don't you think?
I think at the end of the day, it's everybody's responsibility. And so what you end up seeing within companies as they're starting a FinOps practice is that they are creating a team that is multidisciplinary, representing the different stakeholders, from R&D all the way up through procurement, operations, the CFO's office, and going in to try to instill this this financial ownership model across the entire organization, which includes obviously training the engineers, so they understand, how best to leverage the cloud. What are the latest and greatest tactics, in being able to operate and deploy workloads. There's this increasing, this focus around cloud ops, right? We all know about DevOps, but cloud ops is really around, how do you bring those types of DevOps best practices and apply them to operating your entire cloud environment. Again, not just a single application, but your entire cloud environment. And cost management is a key pillar in that. So it's all about education, and then getting all of the respective stakeholders from the R&D all the way up through the CFO office involved, and it requires a commitment from the executive level in the business, right? Because too often we've seen attempts to instill some sort of a mindset fail if there hasn't been executive ownership. So really, I think it begins with management saying that we are going to adopt FinOps best practices, and this is what they look like. We're going to instill training throughout the organization. We're going to bring together a task force, the FinOps committee, if you will, with the representative stakeholders across the business, in order to be able to drive this, what it amounts to, I think, a culture change from the way people have been using the cloud in the past.
Yep. And we talk a lot about journey, right? We use word journey all the time when it comes to cloud financial management and FinOps. Scott, from your experience, any examples, like any good stories? Let's show some successes, right? When organizations started on the right foot and really progressed, to drive some successes there. Any like good story you could share?
Yeah, I mean, there's, we continue to see, and I think I mentioned some of the stats at the beginning, I mean, overall, when companies adopt a FinOps mindset, and I use that word purposely, representing that kind of cultural change, they're able to optimize, I think, the value that the cloud is intrinsically going to provide them, right? I mean, the cloud is there to be able to provide, as I mentioned, agility, the ability to fail fast. There's always that, big, the next AWS bill lurking around the corner. But the adoption of a FinOps mindset is able to allow customers to really have the best of both worlds. We see that same sort of tension in cloud operations, right? Talking to a lot of customers, there's this belief that by adopting the cloud, with its agility and all of that, customers need to give up governance, and it's not the case. You can maintain governance and the proper use of and protection of your data and those types of topics, at the same time being able to have the agility and the cost benefits that come from having an OpEx model that the cloud provides. So we've definitely have seen lots of customers be successful in this area. Unfortunately, I think it's still early days. We continue to see customers that are leaving a lot of money on the table. We've done a lot of work to introduce new services and capabilities to help customers be able to operate their cloud environments more efficiently. I mean, just something like our intelligent tiering on S3. I've seen a number of big companies, that have been able to reduce their their AWS bills, in a couple of cases approaching $1 million a year, just by enabling something like intelligent tiering, which at the end of the day, is it's a very, what I consider, low-hanging fruit best practice. That just, it involves, training the developers on what the benefits are. If they are using infrastructure as code, in order to deploy resources, that they've got that flag set to turn that on. And it's amazing, the amount of money, that can be saved, just by going through and understanding those kind of basic and applying those basic best practices.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Scott, for sharing those examples. I want to encourage everyone who is listening and watching us today. So follow NApps. Okay, you can easily get started. There is link here in the running banner on the bottom. So if you're new to FinOps, this is a way to learn. Bunch of resources NApps team is posting daily to help you to start on the journey and help you to progress on that journey. So absolutely, there's a demo when if you go to get started on that link, and yeah, experts really waiting for you to let them know how they can help. So at the same time, Scott, thank you so very much for your time today. Time is flying. In conclusion, I love to leave our audience with few takeaways. Okay, if there are some pearls of wisdoms we kind of want this session to be remembered by.
Yeah, I mean, just back to the basics. Think about cloud, for the long term, right? So think about how are you going to adopt and use cloud, that cloud operating model I talked about. If you're interested, I encourage you to visit aws.amazon.com/cloudops, where you can learn about the 5 different pillars that make out cloud operations. And definitely, cost is not an afterthought. Cost management is not an afterthought. It needs to be instilled across the entire culture of the organization. So we have a lot of blogs and other material, but if you're interested, you can go to aws.amazon.com/blogs/ AWS Cloud Financial Management. There's a lot of good material there. And then one other resource would be the Cloud Economics team in AWS has a tremendous amount of information on being able to establish FinOps best practices at AWS. And you can find them at aws.amazon.com/economics.
Perfect. Scott, thank you so very much for your time. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.